So there's a new Halo show finally hitting the airwaves after a decade plus of development, and one might imagine that after so much time in entertainment gestation, fans would be excited the show was finally available for their eyes to see. But as far as their most vocal contingents are concerned, excited is not the word to be used in the build-up to Master Chief's live-action introduction. You see, there's this quote from showrunner Stephen Kane, published in Variety on a sprawling feature for the show, where he says, "We didn't look at the game, we didn't talk about the game, we talked about the characters and the world." Now, this article runs thousands of words and pulls quotes from more than a handful of people formerly and currently involved with the production of Amblin's Halo TV series, but what quote would you imagine was pulled out and stripped of context to make the rounds on social media? Stephen Kane's "We didn't look at the game." Not only that, but that was the headline used by dozens of film and TV websites as they, quote, reported this news to their readers. And what was the end result of all this? Well, much weeping and gnashing of teeth at imagined disrespects to the franchise, passionate assumptions that the show would crash and burn or be generally unwatchable, and a deep pool of scatological adjectives used to describe Halo, the television series, as fans and devotees claimed that by ignoring the source material, of course the makers of the show were doomed to fail. And these are such ponderously disingenuous arguments. Because here's the thing, if you actually clicked through to the Variety article, you'd see that that quote from Kane, that they, quote, didn't look at the game, was very specific in its phrasing. They didn't look at the game, they looked at everything else. Halo, like any AAA action franchise these days, is no longer just a piece of interactive fiction. It's books, it's comics, it's other kinds of video games, it's a mini-series, it's a non-Master Chief-oriented TV show, and now it's another TV show. In fact, Halo executive producer Otto Bathurst claimed that the biggest hurdle for the show was not expanding the games out into a television show, but condensing the sprawling universe of the whole of Halo's lore down into a manageable, engaging story. You know, there's this bit in the American version of The Office where Steve Carell's Michael Scott is unhappy with the commercial folks Dunder Mifflin has sent to the Scranton branch to help them make a commercial for local airplay. He thinks their idea for the commercial is too cold, too impersonal, and thinks he has a better idea. So he calls up his boss and his boss's boss to pitch them his idea. His pitch is denied, and his boss replies,
"I'm delegating creativity to creative professionals. It's a different skill set."
This quote will be important in a minute. Now, of the gamut of issues with the immediacy of communication offered to us by the internet, one of the most galling to creatives is that at times it seems everyone thinks they can do your job better than you. This book is garbage, this movie is terrible, this song makes my ears bleed, etc. And all of us at one point or another have fallen victim to this way of thinking, or reading, watching, listening to, or looking at some piece of art and thinking, hey, I could do that. But the folks on Twitter complaining that Stephen Kane, quote, didn't look at the games and instead looked to, quote, the characters and the world are in large part, I can say with certainty, not creative professionals, and likely have never developed their own television program. But it takes a creative professional to look at the first-person shooter and realize that one unkillable man walking down halls and mowing down enemies, perhaps now and then jumping from one spaceship to another in order to give the Covenant back their bomb, does not an interesting television show make. These moments are interesting to the player of a video game because we are participating in them. We're making them happen. We're giving the Covenant back their bomb. And so, Microsoft and Amblin have delegated creativity to creative professionals, not to fans. And please, this is not to say that by not looking at the games, that the Halo TV show will automatically be good. I, in fact, did have a number of issues with the first episode. This is just to say that by the same metric, it is wrong to say that by ignoring the games, this show will automatically be bad. And this is where this essay will pivot in focus a little to what I think is likely the root of this problem: fan service. And fan service is a tricky thing. Put too much in and people get mad, but don't put enough in and people will also get mad. I think that most of the folks mad about Kane's quote in Variety are worried that by not looking at the games, that the show will be Halo in name only and won't include enough familiar material to be considered by their thinking a proper Halo show, worthy of the legacy of the games. And I get it. There's been a lot of video game adaptations over the years that have suffered from this problem. 2005's Doom movie, despite being pitched to studios by id themselves, feels an awful lot like a generic action movie script with Doom nouns slotted into key dialogue. There are all the pieces of what you'd expect from a Doom movie, a Mars base, a BFG, some demons, quote-unquote, but all in service of a fairly boilerplate story that muddles the typical Doom formula by substituting real demonic activity for a convoluted subplot about genetic alteration. But how important is it to make sure an adaptation of a given property is faithful to the literal nuts and bolts of its source material? Let me clarify that question even further. How important is it for an adaptation to adhere to the things of its source material? Well, what's the most critically successful video game adaptation of all time? Making the critical distinction here because the most commercially successful video game adaptation of all time is Duncan Jones' Warcraft, but it has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 28%. And also, I want to make an additional addendum here that I do not think Rotten Tomatoes scores should be taken as gospel, but for our purposes, they are a good litmus test for, is it generally accepted that this film is good? So what then is the quote-unquote best video game adaptation? I was surprised to discover that it's actually a fairly recent film, 2021's adaptation of Red Storm Entertainment's Werewolves Within. This movie adaptation easily takes the top spot for critical reception, scoring 86% on Rotten Tomatoes as of the time of writing this essay. To put that in perspective, the second best scored video game adaptation is Detective Pikachu at 68%, followed closely by Sonic the Hedgehog at 63%. So what makes Werewolves Within so special within the pantheon of filmic adaptations of video games? Does it adhere to the things of its source material? Well, the game is a PSVR-based Mafia-style game, meaning a group of players sit around in a circle and try to decide which player is the werewolf. That's it. That's the whole game. And the success of a movie based on that premise means we're mere months away from the announcement of a live-action Among Us adaptation starring The Rock. But how rigidly does Werewolves Within stick to that premise of a bunch of folks in a medieval village Salem witch trialsing a werewolf from their midst? Well, judging from the trailer, not much. The medieval setting is abandoned for a present-day Stephen King-inspired sleepy and snowbound town, and since the, quote, story of any given game in Red Storm's PSVR Werewolves Within is all but entirely player-generated, Werewolves Within screenwriter Mishna Wolf essentially had free reign to craft her own story. So is that the key to ditch specific aesthetics and instead try to emulate the themes of your source material? Well, not so fast. 2018's Annihilation by Alex Garland, based on the Jeff Vandermeer novel of the same name, does this by adapting the things of Vandermeer's book into a taut 115 minutes. But while keeping the nuts and bolts of Vandermeer's story, Garland changed several key things. For one, he gave all the characters names. In the book, Vandermeer only ever identifies the characters by their jobs, which, is an obvious change to make when you're adapting prose for the screen. Similarly, other portions of Annihilation's more otherworldly details, vaguely described in Vandermeer's prose, were given shape and specificity in Garland's adaptation. So, while structurally and textually similar, Garland and Vandermeer's Annihilations differ most in theme. Vandermeer's original novel is very much a reflection on ecology and the importance of the natural world, with the book being all but directly inspired by Vandermeer's wanderings through the St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge near his home in Florida. But Garland's Annihilation is an exploration of identity and meaning, what makes us, us. And let's look too at Starship Troopers, the 1997 Paul Verhoeven film based on the Robert Heinlein novel of the same name. Heinlein's book is somewhat famously less a novel about the clash of humans and bug armies and more a lecture-focused endorsement of fascism. Verhoeven's film is a much more straightforward action-adventure that, while conforming to the things of Heinlein's novel, ditches the main theme in favor of a satirical skewering of the very philosophies the book endorses. And Verhoeven rather famously said that he only ever read 2 chapters of Heinlein's novel, saying that it was one of the most boring things he'd ever read. But I don't think any of us could argue that Starship Troopers is a bad movie. It's fantastic. So should we be more concerned about things or themes? Well, as should be obvious from the handful of examples I've just given, it depends. It depends on the kind of story you're trying to tell. And the story the Halo team is trying to tell is, according to Kane, a story about a man discovering his own humanity and finding out what are the costs of turning human beings into killing machines. So right there, folks who've played the games and read the article will see a parallel between the games and the show. The games have long explored the psychology of Master Chief, a genetically enhanced super soldier who was kidnapped as a child and conscripted into humanity's spacefaring military. Primarily told through Chief's relationships with other super soldiers called Spartans and through his relationship with his AI companion, Cortana. So it came as no surprise that in addition to framing Master Chief as the protagonist of this TV show, Jen Taylor's Cortana would also feature within the narrative. And this was another bit many fans had issue with when the first trailer for the show dropped, primarily because Cortana does not look like she does in the games. But does she need to? Is that important to the story? Does the crux of Chief's narrative arc hinge on Cortana's blueness? No! What's wrong with you? Jen Taylor, in that same article for Variety, posed it this way by asking, do you want it to be exactly the way you've already played it or already seen it? In the Halo TV show, is it vitally important that we see Master Chief dual-wielding Needlers or giving the Covenant back their bomb? No, this isn't a game, it's a show. The methods of storytelling are entirely different, and the way the audience interacts with the story is entirely different. Playwright and screenwriter David Mamet famously said that audiences will not tune in to watch information, meaning that while the details of the world are important, the show needs to be focused primarily on the characters and the drama surrounding their interaction in that world. So if you watch the show or have watched the show and didn't like the way they told the story, or you think this or that arc didn't land, or the themes were muddled by whatever, those are perfectly valid criticisms. But to declare outright that a show will be bad because its creators decided to actually consider how to adapt a story told in one medium into an entirely different medium, and how the means by which they might convey that story would differ, that is invalid.